Christmas story. We've seen it depicted on countless Christmas cards. A new king of the Jews is to be born. A star will show the way to wise men who will follow it till it comes to stand over the place of birth. Shepherds keeping watch at night are told by an angel of this birth, and that the sign that they have found the child will be a manger, and a heavenly host sing praises of exaltation in the highest heaven. And so we see the images of the star over the stable or cave, with the child in the manger between the ox and ass. Despite our familiarity with the manger motif, the reason for its inclusion in the story has always been a mystery, and the search for the identity of the Christmas star has exercised great minds for centuries. Why was the manger, according to the angel in Luke's Gospel, the divine sign that would show the shepherds they had found the new king? And how was it that a star told the Magi that a great new king was coming in Matthew's Gospel? So when the solution came to me, it was very satisfying. I was building on an existing theory. There have been various theories about the Christmas star, but one of the most interesting came from Ivor Bulmer Thomas. He pointed out that with Magi best translated as astrologers, Matthew's story of the star's appearance in the east, forward motion, and then standstill over the place where the child is, sounds very much like the synod cycle of a planet, a wandering star, where a period of disappearance from the sky ends with a rise in the east just before dawn, followed by several weeks of prograde motion that slows to apparent standstill or first stationary point as the planet turns retrograde against the backdrop of fixed constellations. It was while I was exploring Bulmer Thomas's theory of the hovering Christmas star being Jupiter, the star of kings, going stationary while turning retrograde, that the answer came to me. I was exploring this by using astronomy software to watch Jupiter do just this around the time of Christ's birth. And looking at 4 BC, I was amazed to see that this happened in the centre part of Cancer the Crab. In other words, the place where in ancient astrology Jupiter was said to be exalted. In other words, with its benevolent power amplified. But also, even more intriguingly, I knew this was the location of the star cluster which has, since ancient times, been called the Manger. And I knew this must be it, the solution to the mystery of the manger and the question of the Christmas star. Whether in the Hellenistic astrology of the period or its Babylonian precursor, and from the Assyrian king Esarhaddon in 680 BCE to the Emperor Augustus, the passage of Jupiter through its astrological exaltation zone in the middle of the sign of Cancer was taken as a great and beneficial omen for a new king. And the visible identifier of this middle part of the crab is the Manger star cluster. Ptolemy claimed first stationary point produced an intensification of astrological power, so Jupiter at first station in its exaltation zone would have been taken as a very good omen for a new king. There is a directly comparable case, namely the birth chart of Augustus, emperor at the time of Christ's birth. In Matthew's Gospel, the Magi rejoiced exceedingly at seeing the star, visited Mary, and saw her child, and here they fell down and worshipped him. It's previously been observed that the astrologers falling in amazement before the child is one of the aspects of the nativity story that is echoed in the stories relating to the birth of the Emperor Augustus, along with his mother having been made pregnant by a god, Apollo in Augustus's case, and pre-announcement by signs and portents. Suetonius, writing circa 121 AD, tells in his Life of the Emperor how when Augustus consulted Theogenes and gave the time of his birth, the astrologer fell at his feet because of the great destiny he saw there. He tells too how the emperor later had coins stamped with the image of the constellation Capricorn, this being the sign under which he was born. This story was not merely invented in the 2nd century, for we know coins of this type were indeed minted by Augustus. Now we are able to add a further item to the list of similarities between the births of Augustus and Jesus. Namely, the astrologers in both stories seem to have fallen to their knees in amazement for precisely the same reason. It cannot simply have been a Capricorn connection on its own that made the astrologer fall adoringly to his knees before Augustus when he read the future emperor's birth chart. In fact, the most regal and imperial feature of the horoscope for the accepted birth date of Augustus, September the 23rd, 63 BCE, the day Augustus himself said he was born, is, believe it or not, the presence of Jupiter central in Cancer, its sign of exaltation, just as with Jesus, as we have now seen. Indeed, this celestial circumstance even fits with the description of one born with Jupiter at exaltation in Cancer in the Mathesis of the 4th century CE astrologer Firmicus Maternus. Such a one will be highborn, famous, always ruling great states, perhaps the first 10 of states. A most fitting omen too, then, for one who would fulfill the Isaiah messianic prophecy by being a ruler of nations. This feature of Augustus' birth chart, i.e. Jupiter central in Cancer, its place of exaltation, has been recognized as the foundational core of the chart's auspiciousness for a future ruler. What appears to have been missed, however, is a cross-referencing of this together with a simultaneous awareness that the most notable feature of this exaltation zone of Jupiter is Proserpe, the manger. If this had been considered, then the logic of the Christian nativity star too would surely have unravelled very quickly by means of the obvious and direct parallel. For really what we have in Theogenes and Augustus is simply an astrologer, a magus, who kneels in adoration before a god-man world ruler after seeing a wandering star exalted at the manger at the time of this future ruler's birth. This should sound familiar. We can now understand the heavenly host in Luke. And suddenly there was with the angel a great multitude of the heavenly host, praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest heaven." Astrological exaltation in Greek was hypsoma, from hypsos, height. To exalt means to praise to the heights, to raise on high. The exaltation points of the planets were locations of stars that were believed to praise those planets greatly and thus magnify their power. In Hellenistic astrology, it was literally the stars themselves that had the power. The manger, being at the exaltation of Jupiter, was therefore a cluster of stars that praised Jupiter highly when the planet passed near. And Luke has the shepherds out under an open sky at night, seeing the heavenly host praising God and singing "Glory to God in the highest," en hepsistois. Straight after the angel has told them that the Saviour, Soter, will be found that day in a manger, en fatne. The phrase multitude of the heavenly host, plethos stratias oraniou, is closely echoed by the host of heaven, te stratia tu oranou, in Acts 7:42, where from the context is understood to mean heavenly bodies and has indeed been translated as stars. Applying the same interpretation of this phrase, army of heaven, and given that praising to the heights is synonymous with exalting, we now find in Luke a multitude of stars that are exalting the one who has just been called Soter, Saviour. In the case of Jupiter, the phrase highest heaven is particularly pertinent. As we've seen, because it seems likely that the reason Cancer was chosen as the exaltation of this kingly planet is that it was the highest point the sun reached along the ecliptic. So Jupiter was literally in the highest heaven at this point, in that sense, a suitable place for the Most High. Furthermore, Soter was a common epithet for Jupiter. It's not hard to see how Luke's version evolved from the original sign of messianic birth. What the Star Watchers were really to look for was the exaltation of Soter in the manger. This would indicate the day the child was born. You may be asking why the presence of the manger in the Nativity was a mystery. It's down partly to the word used in Luke's original text, which was written in ancient Greek. He doesn't talk about a common or garden sign, but uses the word semeion, which is used in the New Testament several times to denote miraculous signs, portents, wonders, and tokens that indicate major events at hand, and to authenticate something or someone as being in accordance with God's purpose. Why, of all things, would the sign be an animal's hay basket? As things have played out, the manger has functioned, from the narrative point of view, as a paradox, which tends to make stories more memorable, and it certainly worked in this case. The new King of Kings has to be placed in a humble manger because nowhere else is available. So you might think Luke invented the manger motif himself for this reason. However, these early Christian writers weren't in the business of inventing key motifs from scratch. They were believers who set out to record the traditions of which they were aware. They weren't above inventing explanations for motifs, but they wouldn't pull them out of thin air. And so we find that in another early account, the Proto-Evangelium of James, which didn't share Luke's luck in ultimately being chosen as gospel, the manger was present but with a different explanation. In that version, the manger served the function of a hiding place for the baby, so Herod's men couldn't find him, rather than being the only bed available due to all the inns being full. So it doesn't look like Luke invented the manger motif, and he certainly didn't in the early years have the monopoly on explaining why it was used. So if the manger didn't come ready formed from Luke's imagination, where did it come from? It's true that several motifs present in the Nativity story, such as the virgin birth and the birth in Bethlehem, came from Old Testament messianic prophecies. And as it happens, the prophet Isaiah did include a mention of a feeding trough in his writings, but it doesn't look like the original source of the nativity manger for a number of reasons. Firstly, the motifs in the nativity that come from the Old Testament have certain clear characteristics. They are literal, prophetic, messianic, and explicitly referenced back to the Old Testament within the New Testament Gospels as being logical fulfillments of those prophecies. Isaiah's mention of a feeding trough, on the other hand, doesn't have any of those features. He's speaking allegorically rather than literally. It's about his present day rather than a prophecy. It's about Jehovah rather than the Messiah, and it's not referenced by Luke as being fulfilled by the nativity manger, which would be out of character for the Gospels if that was where the nativity manger came from. What Isaiah actually wrote was, "An ox knows its owner, and a donkey its master's feeding trough, but Israel does not know." From the context of the words that follow it, we know this means if even an ox and a donkey know where their food is coming from, why don't the people of Israel know that their power comes from God? The animals know which of a number of feeding troughs belong to their master and return to that one. There's no suggestion that they will find their master asleep in it, nor in fact is there any suggestion that God's power would come to the people via an actual, physical, literal feeding trough at some future time. Isaiah would probably have laughed at the notion of his allegory being taken so literally. It's true that there's every indication that Isaiah's words about the ox and ass were indeed seized upon by early Christians to give some more symbolic context and meaning to the nativity manger, because they often chose to show it flanked by these two animals, even though the Gospels themselves didn't mention them. The manger was a motif which must have seemed to be in need of some such layer of meaning, so they went beyond the Gospels themselves and back to Isaiah and managed to find something which could, slightly tortuously, be used to represent people recognizing God in the form of Jesus, i.e., knowing their master's feeding trough. But there is nothing in those words from Isaiah, nor in Luke's Gospel itself, to suggest this was where the nativity manger came from in the first place. There's too much of a gap between Isaiah chastising the people of his own time for being dumber than an allegorical ass on the one hand, and Luke's shepherds, several hundred years later, being told they will find the newborn king lying in a manger. This motif of the manger must have come from somewhere else. This is where we turn to the astrological explanation, which is simply that the original must have been along these lines. You will find a child who was born when Jupiter came to stand at the place where it is exalted by the starry host in the highest heaven, namely over the manger. And in late October and early November 4 BC, it came to an apparent standstill at that place, in other words, at the manger. It's very easy to see how this could have been remembered in two different corrupted versions. Luke's, where the angel tells how the sign of the birth of Jesus will be the manger, and where the host of heaven sing in exaltation to the highest heaven, and Matthew, where the astrologers watch a star move forward and then come to a standstill at the time of the birth. Did the Jews of the period accept astrology? The general consensus on this is that some did and some didn't. And really, this is impossible to argue with. That some of them certainly did can be categorically stated in the affirmative due to the presence of references to it in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where we find two texts with astrological content, both dated to the time of Jesus. One of these, named the Zodiacal Physiognomy, has been recognized by several scholars as showing connections to the astrology of Chusa. This is particularly interesting, not just because it shows there were Jews in the immediate period and vicinity of the nativity story who had astrological interests, but also because the same Chusa text, which it draws on, gives details on the exaltations of the planets and, crucially, describes the manger contained within the Cancer constellation. The manger was a well-known asterism, or mini-constellation. It had been made famous along with the other constellations by Aratus in a work second only to Homer in its great and long-lived popularity in antiquity. The early Christian Paul, the Apostle, clearly knew it as he quoted it in his speech to the Athenians. The manger was one of the constellations recognized by Hellenistic astrologers. Matthew's star has become known as the Star of Bethlehem based on the assumption that the place where it hovered was the town and that it guided the Magi to this town. To come down from the sky and hang over the town would have been a great wonder, but there is nothing in Matthew to suggest that the star did anything that anyone other than an astrologer would find significant. And he never says it hung over Bethlehem. In truth, the idea that Matthew describes the star leading the way to Bethlehem is nonsense. Herod had already told the Magi to go to Bethlehem. We can even go further and say that the Bethlehem birth of the Messiah was a given for the Magi from the outset, based on the Old Testament prophecy of Micah, which Matthew actually quotes. So, Star of Bethlehem is clearly a misnomer. There's no reason why a star needed to be sent to lead the way, as the Bethlehem prophecy had already done the job and the Magi were on their way there already. If the star had hovered more locally over the very house, then it would have been even less of a matter that required specialist astrologers, but would have been a wonder for all to see. But the star itself was not an overt wonder, visible to all in Matthew's Gospel account, but rather something that Herod had to ask astrologers about to find the exact time of its appearance. Clearly, clearly an astrological matter, not an open wonder. So the very local hovering star can be ruled out. If the star wasn't leading the way in a navigational sense, in what sense was it helping the Magi find the Messiah? Well, the clue's in the name. They were astrologers. Once again, we're brought back to the astrological interpretation. It's not actually that controversial a suggestion. Theories explaining the Star of Bethlehem in the context of Hellenistic astrology have been taken very seriously for a number of years. Such theories argue that, whilst older attempts to identify the Star of Bethlehem have sought bright and unusual celestial events, such as conjunctions of Venus and Jupiter, comets, meteors, or even supernovas, such an identification is not in fact supported by the text of Matthew's Gospel, which makes no reference to an unusually bright star. All we are told is that the Magi, the astrologers, informed Herod that they had seen the star of the new king of the Jews in the east, and that Herod asked them the time when it appeared, or more literally, he asked the time of the appearing star, and that it moved ahead of the Magi until it stood over the place where the child was. Since Hellenistic astrology has become a valid medium through which to seek a better understanding of the Star of Bethlehem, we should feel yet more assured that it's worth asking what star came into conjunction with the Manger cluster, when it did so, and why this was considered particularly significant in the Messianic context. Some well-received examples of these astrological theories on the star's identity are Molnar's theory on the Bethlehem star as the occultation of Jupiter by the moon in Aries, and Koch's theory that the star was Venus at its heliacal rise. However, they were not the first astrological theories of the Star of Bethlehem. As mentioned, back in 1992, Ivor Bulmer-Thomas had previously argued for a Babylonian astrological context with a theory that focused on the motion of the star as described by Matthew. Although Bulmer-Thomas never brought the manger into this theory, now that we've done so, it is his theory that is now revealed as having been along the right lines. Bulmer-Thomas suggested that the significant moments of the star's appearance in the east, its progressive motion, and its subsequent coming to a standstill in Matthew's account correspond to the heliacal rise, prograde motion, and then first stationary point at the start of retrograde motion of a planet. As well as noting that the surviving account sounds like a description of a stationing planet, Bulmer-Thomas pointed out that cuneiform texts give ample evidence for the close observation and recording of the retrograde motions, including stationary points, of planets, and particularly Jupiter, by Babylonian astronomers preceding and at the time of Christ, complete with procedures for calculation based on the expected periods of time between a planet's disappearance, reappearance, first stationary point, second stationary point, and so on. Bulmer-Thomas wasn't seeking to explain the manger because he was only concerned with the star in Matthew's Gospel in isolation. So when he chose the Jupiter first stationary point in 5 BC as the time referred to when the star observed by the Magi came to a standstill, this choice was made without looking for the sign Luke's shepherds were told to look for. My own addition is to say that while Bulmer-Thomas was correct that the description of the star corresponds to the synod cycle of Jupiter, the year in question was not 5 BCE, but rather 4 BCE, as this was when the first stationary point was at the manger. Jupiter's month-long absence from the sky occurred in the summer of 4 BCE, and then towards the end of June, the planet appeared again in the east, rising shortly before dawn, the heliacal rise. There then followed about 4 months during which Jupiter moved in the normal direction against the backdrop of the fixed stars. Then, sure enough, towards the end of this 4-month period of prograde motion following heliacal rise, Jupiter started to slow down, the first stage of going retrograde. And around the 25th of October, it stopped completely and spent several days standing still at stationary point. So, after appearing in the east and then moving forward, as in Matthew, it came to stand at the manger, as in Luke. One of the dates for Herod's death that has been seriously proposed and received is early spring 1 BCE, and this fits well with the relevant records and would fit with the timing for a birth at the end of October or beginning of November 4 BCE. Josephus tells us Herod died between an eclipse and the spring Passover. To be true to the narrative, there ought to be quite some time between the child's birth and Herod's death. The massacre of the innocents occurred after Herod had learned the time of the appearing star, and as a result he killed boys 2 years old and under in the canonical Matthew. Reconstructing the astrological original, this must have been because the Magi told him the Jupiter-Manger conjunction occurred at a date that would make this logical, and Herod's death is the very next event related in Matthew's account after this slaughter. This puts the date of Herod's death in or around the time of the child's 3rd year, i.e. when the child was still 2 years old. This period between the January 1 BC eclipse and the spring Passover is consistent with this timing. The child is born around the 25th of October 4 BCE, and counting forward, the child is still 2 in spring 1 BCE, not being 3 until the 25th of October 1 BCE. It's crucial to understand that to the astrologers whose lore derived from Alexandria and before that Babylon, the Manger asterism was significant for this one particular planet, Jupiter, because the Manger is the visible identifier of the middle part of Cancer, and this region was held to be the astrological exaltation zone of Jupiter, a particularly favourable place for the planet to be, particularly in the birth chart of a great ruler. Based on the idea from Babylonian astrology that a certain zodiac sign was the secret house of each of the various wandering bodies, in Hellenistic astrology, each of these bodies, the sun, moon, and visible planets, was assigned a particular place on the ecliptic as its exaltation, a beneficial place for it to be in a natal horoscope. Added to this, Jupiter was held by the likes of Roman astrologers such as Vettius Valens and Firmicus Maternus to have an astrological power that conferred crowns of office, and Jupiter at exaltation is a particularly potent example of a positioning where Jupiter was held to have this power. To an astrologer of the time, Jupiter located at its exaltation in a natal chart would have been significant, for Jupiter in its exalted sign of Cancer was one of the most powerful indications of royal birth, and first stationary point produced an intensifying and strengthening effect. Ptolemy gives 15 degrees Cancer as the exaltation of Jupiter in his table of dignities in his Tetrabiblos, i.e. the centre of Cancer, each zodiac sign having 30 degrees, and it's more generally thought of as applying to the middle decan of Cancer, 10 degrees to 20 degrees, of which the most notable feature is Praesepe, the Manger. The tightest range for the Manger itself would be from about 11.5 degrees to 13.5 degrees Cancer, looking at modern maps of the stars, but as a nebula, it has a blurry or glowing edge that isn't distinct. And in fact, Teucer, in the Rhetorius Teucer text, says it extends from 9 degrees to 15 degrees Cancer, which makes it touch the exaltation. In any case, an allowable orb or variance from exactitude for a conjunction is considered to be about 10 degrees. Jupiter, at first stationary point 4 BCE, was at 8.5 Cancer, just 0.5 degrees from Praesepe, according to Teucer's figures, a close conjunction, and certainly within the allowable orb. The early medieval Arab astrologer al-Biruni says that there are differences of opinion. Some say the exaltation zone extends a few degrees on either side of the exaltation degree. Some say it extends from the start of the sign to the degree, and others that the planet is exalted the whole time it's in the sign. In the Proto-Evangelium of James, thought to date from around 145 AD, this being almost as old as Matthew and Luke, there is a curious suspension of time episode which can be very satisfyingly explained by means of the current theory, simply through considering how the astrological material would have been received by non-astrologers. Mary says she's about to have the baby, so Joseph takes her down off the donkey and leads her into a cave. Then he looks into the sky and he says, "I looked up to the pole of the heavens and saw it standing, and saw the sky astonished, and the birds of the air keeping still. Just as Mary was about to give birth, the stars above stood still, while below on the ground there was a feeding trough, a manger, and the activity around this manger also halted." It was presumably the same trough in which Mary would hide the infant a few paragraphs further on in the same text. If you didn't understand Hellenistic astrology, but you heard the account of how a sign in the heavens indicated the coming of the Messiah, and you knew it involved a star coming to a halt and a feeding trough, you might well interpret along exactly those lines. As non-astrologers who didn't know that planets turn retrograde in the normal course of things and stand still while doing so, nor that the manger was the name of an astrologically relevant mini-constellation, the take-home features were different. When they heard that a star's course was arrested and that it changed direction, they assumed the sign must have been in the form of things being driven from their course. They recalled a motif involving things coming to a standstill at a feeding trough, but not knowing this was to do with astrology, they turned it into an actual trough around which activity had ceased. "And I looked down upon the earth, and I saw a trough lying, and work people reclining, and their hands were in the trough, and those that were eating did not eat, and those that were rising did not carry it up, and those that were conveying anything to their mouths did not convey it." Traces of another fragment of this same astrological aspect of the original nativity story survived visually and textually in the strongly embedded and widely attested tradition that when the Magi arrived at the house where Jesus was, they did so after the second year since the birth was past, and when seeing the star, they also saw the child seated on the Virgin's lap. Textually, this turns up in a source that is thought to date from the 7th century CE, namely the Pseudo-Gospel of Matthew. The Magi episode here follows the canonical Matthew very closely in many respects, but there are some key differences. Both say that after Jesus' birth, the Magi came to Jerusalem asking to see the king that had been born, and saying they observed his star rising in the east. But while Matthew just says this visit happens after Jesus' birth and only implies how much time has passed since the child's birth by the age of the boys Herod killed, Pseudo-Matthew explicitly confirms this Magi visit happens after the second year was past. Both say the Magi rejoiced exceedingly when they saw the star, and that they went into the house and saw the mother with the child. But Pseudo-Matthew specifically says the Magi, which he makes 3 in number, found the child sitting in the lap of his mother. Though this text is thought to date from the 7th century, this tradition can be traced right back to the 3rd century in quite a few visual sources, all showing the 3 Magi arriving and pointing to the star hovering over the Virgin with the child on her lap. If astrologers are looking at a star, then they're concerned with its position in the starry sky, the signs, decans, exaltations, etc. Here we see them observing the star over the seated Virgin with child. This is immediately interesting because a child on a seated woman's lap is one of the ecliptic constellations. Indeed, it's the very image of the first decan of Virgo in the system of the Hellenistic astrologers. We know this because the matchup between Tusser's description of it and the depiction in the Ptolemaic Dendera zodiac cannot be a coincidence. And here it gets really interesting.
In October 2 BC, the time of the child's second birthday, Jupiter was indeed in this first decan of Virgo, and then over the course of that year it moved through that decan, and by the end of the year it reached first stationary point. In fact, it did so on the 25th of December, and then in the start of 1 BC, in retrograde motion, it continued to move through the first decan, and it stayed there until late summer. So Jupiter did indeed spend most of the child's third year in the first decan of Virgo.
It sounds like the meeting with the astrologers actually occurred in Egypt, probably Alexandria, a centre of Hellenistic astrology, because we're told that the Holy Family fled into Egypt to escape Herod, and that by the time they got back, Herod had died. We've noted Jupiter started going retrograde through the first decan of Virgo, the Virgin with child on her lap, at the start of 1 BC, and that Herod's death must have been spring 1 BC. This paints a picture of them fleeing into Egypt in time to visit the astrologers in early 1 BC, and then being home by spring shortly after Herod's death.
But there's something else that's nice to note. While this theory as a whole doesn't support the 25th of December as the birthday of Jesus, as luck would have it, Jupiter was stationary on this date in 2 BC, hovering over the constellation of the child on his mother's lap. Whilst this might not give the 25th of December as the date of birth of the child, it does make it a suitable date for us to think of as the date when the Magi visited the child and read his destiny in the stars. This is traditionally known as Epiphany, when the divinity of the child, according to the story, became visible to the Magi. This was the day when the Magi arrived and gave their gifts of gold, myrrh and frankincense to the child, which is appropriate, of course, as Christmas Day is the day of giving and receiving gifts.